So I think to kind of begin with, I was going to ask Dr. Shehabi and Jason to kind of respond to the film and kind of share some of your thoughts. So who wants to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Shall I go first?
Okay, I felt that the film was a good visual, exploratory, investigative piece into issues that need a bit of unpacking theoretically. So the three examples that you picked, you began with Afghanistan, and that's very much an engineered conflict. It was an invasion. Obviously, it wasn't the perfect utopia before the invasion happened in 2001, but we know the impact of that invasion in creating conflict and some of the disasters that were engineered, basically. In Haiti, it was a natural disaster, which liberal assumptions would make you think these are ahistorical, apolitical events that happen. But why do natural disasters even always affect the most vulnerable in society? And that's no coincidence. And we saw that in your film. I mean, a lot of the people that you interviewed were the marginalised and the impoverished, who happen to live in sites of where labour is required for this kind of exploitation, or at least economic exploitation. And the third example that you explored was Papua New Guinea, and this was natural resource extraction. Again, large multinational company Rio Tinto going in there, carrying out intensive extraction using and copper is a heavily labour-intensive extractive process, and then just leaving suddenly and leaving a legacy of just no jobs, no prospects of wealth for these people. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, which is just that, yes, disasters affect the most vulnerable communities in these areas, and they remain perpetually at risk. So Afghanistan's never recovered. Haiti still continues many years on, and the prospect doesn't look very good there. And Papua New Guinea you've seen as well. The recovery process after you've depended on natural mineral extraction sometimes never happens. And secondly, these disasters often reveal the embedded problems within society themselves. So they're exacerbated by these disasters, the power dynamics, the power relations that exist within them. In many places, poor institutional democratic infrastructure. So it's easy to come and say, bring aid, let's have accountability, when you don't have the institutions in those countries for that accountability to happen. But to be fair, I mean, if you went to knock on a minister's door in this country to ask for an interview, I doubt you'd get an interview with them. So, I mean, that's not something that is an example of disarray necessarily, but again, your film did demonstrate other aspects of that. And finally, what your film showed was that the rebuilding process has become an opportunity for profit, and a way for stakeholders, let's call them basically companies and governments, to re-envision and rebuild communities and re-engineer what growth and development looks like there. And that's the scary part of this, is how aid itself becomes a political tool and can change communities themselves by empowering certain actors, by disempowering others, changing our agendas. So, for example, my NGO, we refuse to take US aid funding or government funding in that sense, because how much independence do you have, oversight, how much of your information, how much control does the donor have on you, how much say do you have in that process? We're conscious of that, but others are not. Others are more desperate than we are, for example. And those are the key things. So that's really the aspect is, there's a lot of political economy in this, looking at how, you touched a little bit on it, but how social relations, basically how some of the situations are influenced by lobbyists, politicians, lawyers, PR companies, assemblage of actors who within this power asymmetry really lead to even further impoverishment in these areas. Those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Should we just go ahead now then?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so scribbled down a few thoughts here. First of all, I should say I loved the film. I thought there were a couple of really striking stories, actually, that, if anything, were buried. One was the bit about Chinese sub-imperialism in Afghanistan. And this makes me worry about the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It's interesting because there's a discussion about whether China will be more progressive in its dealings with poor global south countries, and it's clearly not always the case. The bit about housing being linked to industrial parks in Haiti, I thought was striking and worthy of investigation in its own rights, and its connection to forced relocation. I mean, that's clearly disastrous. So I guess, for me, I identified kind of three different narrative threads that the film deals with, and one is disaster capitalism properly, which is putatively the theme of the film. The other is just extractive capitalism that creates disasters. And then the third is the narrative and argument you have about aid. And it's really that third one that I want to talk about here, because I think that it's a strong argument, but also I think could be pushed further. And I think I even have a critique of where you end up on it in the very last instance. So ultimately, the critique that you offer is that aid is often used to do harmful things. It gets tangled up in the corruption of states and in capitalist profiteering and so on. And you say things like aid is failing the people of Haiti or Afghanistan, et cetera. And I think that's a really important critique. But to me, it could go further, because the implication here is that, if, in fact, you actually say this, if aid was just used more, correctly, more transparently, more democratically, et cetera, it would do a lot of good and help sort of fix the world, and you even say the word lead to independence or freedom or something like that. And maybe that's not actually the argument you would stand by ultimately, but nonetheless, I do think it's a common assumption that we need to question. Because the way that I would see it is that the real problem with aid is that it misses the point of the problem altogether in the first place, right? So even at the best of times, when it's used properly and transparently, et cetera, it does not even pretend to fix the root causes of the problems that it purports to address, right? And to me, the ultimate effect of aid, both in terms of policy practice as well as discourse, is to obscure the real causes of the problems in the first place. Okay, so we know that rich nations give an enormous amount of aid to poor nations every year, in the region of $130 billion a year, right? That's the aid budget, which is, for reference, more than all of the profits that all of the banks in the US make each year. So it's an enormous amount of money. But interestingly, vastly more than that flows in the other direction, right? From the global south to the global north, from poor countries to rich countries, in the form of multinational profits, interest payments on foreign debts, illicit financial flows and tax evasion, and so on. And in fact, 3 times more money flows each year from global south to global north than the other way around, right? So the south is a net creditor to the global north. So what's at stake here, what we're dealing with here, is a global economy that is designed fundamentally in the interests of a small number of rich nations at the expense of the vast majority of the rest of the world. And that has been the case since colonialism, which actually even appears in your film a little bit, and remains the case now in the way that the trade system is structured, in the way the finance system is structured, the way the debt system is structured, the way that governance works in bodies like the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO, et cetera. Clearly what needs to be fixed here is not the internal pathologies of poor countries. I mean, sure, that may be a problem, but there's a broader history and a broader political economy that's got to be taken account of here. So for instance, right now we know that only 5%, right, of all new income generated by GDP growth each year globally goes to the poorest 60% of humanity. I mean, that's how skewed the global economy is. That's what needs to be fixed, and aid is not going to solve that problem, right? I think we can all agree that we need to shift from a discourse of aid to a discourse of justice and even reparations, acknowledging the historical legacy of this problem. For me, like the problem with aid is that the discourse of aid makes the takers in the system seem like givers and gives them a kind of moral high ground. So I wouldn't even be satisfied with transparent aid from the US if I was Haiti, right? Because there's a long history of very problematic US intervention that has created the problems in Haiti to begin with, right? So the US has supported right-wing dictatorships in Haiti. The Bush administration and France toppled the Aristide administration in 2004. They were upset, by the way, by his attempts to increase the minimum wage for Haitian workers, right? And so they got rid of him as a result. And this is the case across the global south with Western-backed interventions that dismantle progressive political movements. in 2011, the government of Haiti did in fact end up raising the minimum wage to a whopping $0.61, I guess 61 cents per hour, right? And that enraged U.S. companies like is it called Levi Strauss? Levi Strauss, the jean company. I'm thinking of the Anthropologist. It's really bad. And Hanes, right? And they got the U.S. State Department to intervene and force Haiti to reverse the minimum wage law, right? Obama was behind that decision, the beloved liberal of the U.S. So, and then of course, in that same year, in 2011, the U.S. State Department manipulated the Haitian elections to swing it in favor of the preferred candidate, right? And this is part of hundreds of years of interference in Haiti's history. So I'm not really sure that the discourse about aid just needs to be better actually goes far enough. I guess I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested in this increasing reliance that sort of newspapers, magazines have on foundation money in order to cover issues like international development and aid. And so think sort of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, The Guardian. My question for you guys really is, what are your collective perceptions of the way that aid is reported by journalists? And does foundation money compromise objectivity? Also, is it better to embrace the funding if the alternative is that these issues aren't being reported at all? Who wants to tackle that?
I'll say a few brief things about that. I mean, yeah. Let me answer that in a slightly roundabout way. So in the last years, often when you go to some of these kind of places, and a few years ago in 2015, I lived in South Sudan, which is not in the film, obviously, and often if you wanted to get to a place, to visit, to report, you have no choice but to go with the UN or with an NGO. Simply logistically, there was no other alternative. So increasingly, this is not on one hand inherently new, but it's become far more common. It's almost like the NGOization of journalism, that a lot of journalists will feel a little bit uncomfortable maybe if you did maybe want to be critical of NGO X, maybe you wouldn't be that as keen to do it because you worry about losing access next time. And when it comes to, say, South Sudan, which is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, the only way to get around the country is through UN planes. It's the only way. There's no roads in the country. It's a complete basket case. And I know the UN has definitely excluded a lot of people, journalists who have been critical of the UN there, and there's a lot of reason to be critical of the UN there. That doesn't quite answer the question about sponsoring, the Guardian's aid reporting, I know, but that to me is an interesting question. I mean, my view is, yes, I've taken those UN flights because you have no choice, and have I been critical of the UN? Yes, sometimes. Have I sometimes held my words? I don't think I have. Maybe I've internalised it so much that I don't even realise. I don't think I have. And I guess I'd also say in a place like South Sudan, which again is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, to me that was the starkest example of a country I've actually ever been to that shows, on the one hand, it's deeply problematic that the country is, yes, run by war criminals. That's obviously bad. But it's basically supported by the UN and NGOs. If they left tomorrow, the country would collapse more than it is now. On the other hand, it's highly worrying that the country is basically run by people who are based in New York. And obviously there are officials on the ground in South Sudan, but leadership-wise, they're unelected. And to me, I don't at all think the UN and NGOs need to pull out tomorrow. That would make it worse. But at the same time, these are kind of indefinite situations. South Sudan remains broken. That won't change anytime soon. So you have this indefinite situation where countries, more and more countries actually are run by unelected leaders in New York, London, wherever it may be. That is deeply worrying, deeply colonial. Doesn't mean there's not invaluable life-saving work being done in those countries. I've seen it, there is. But those questions are too rarely asked, I think, about who is really running a country. Not that the leaders are doing a very good job at all in, say, South Sudan or Afghanistan. But I think it's important to ask whether we want NGOs and UN officials to run nations. And more nations now are like that. It's getting worse, not better. But you can answer maybe the other two about the other issue. I haven't ignored it, but I just thought I'd answer some other way.
No, thanks. So yeah, I mean, do you guys have any kind of strong feelings on the way that you're seeing aid and development being reported in the media, or
I think the media, in my point of view, sometimes is part of the status quo in the sense it perpetuates some of these systemic issues, either innocently or not. So, for example, I mean, it struck me, I spent a summer in California, and I was visiting these foundations like Bill Gates and Midyar and all of these. These are the big tech foundations, and they all have like massive humanitarian programs, and it just struck me as a massive tax avoidance kind of thing. So like, why not just give all my money to charity, pay less tax, and then I can also control and get the cred, right? Like, you know, I'm saving the world, and I can go out there and eradicate AIDS, and you know, and do all of this humanitarian work that makes me feel better about myself. And then it was all kind of quantified, and it was, you know, impact measurements and what's the kind of social entrepreneur. Like, it's kind of moved a bit from just giving aid to actually show me what, you know, I need to know how effective you're going to be with, you know, like, it's not accountability more than I think there is a shift towards just giving cash to just thinking about how that cash is going to be spent, but that's not necessarily in a kind of, you know, using performance measurements and all of that. That's not necessarily something that you can ask someone in Sudan or someone to kind of, you know, what are your performance measures if I give you this money, or what's your social, you know, that kind of, it doesn't fit sometimes with what the situation requires or needs. But yeah, I mean, good luck to Bill Gates for trying to eradicate AIDS. I don't know how I'm not very, to be honest, it's not a literature, or, you know, I know there's a massive literature on humanitarian aid and the impact that has. The Gates Foundation is massive in terms of, especially in terms of the kind of the vaccination space and all of those things. But yeah, there's other issues. Are they subverting the role that pharma companies are playing in those areas in terms of providing the cheap medication that can actually be effective there? Are they all just being guinea pigs under the guise of you know, under the guise of humanitarianism to develop new medicine? There's all of these so many issues that I don't even know where to start off with, to be completely honest.
So I think one of the problems is that, and we actually discussed this when we met last time, is that I think that journalists, because they no longer receive proper salaries to do investigation, right, end up taking talking points from the UN, from the Gates Foundation, et cetera, and that becomes our news. And so a lot of the narratives that come out of agencies that have a conflict of interest, actually, with some of these stories, just end up on our news feeds as taken for granted, right? So for me, I mean, one of the big problems that I've had to confront is the dominance UN discourse on poverty reduction, right? That's been so central to the Millennium Development Campaign and now the SDGs. This idea that we have sort of this really incredible reduction in global poverty and it's soon to be eradicated, et cetera, right? There's actually been a very strong scholarly pushback against the data that the UN is using for that. With remarkable consensus actually on the fact that they're using the wrong poverty lines, they're using the wrong goalposts, et cetera, et cetera. And yet there's very little reporting among journalists on this strong alternative opinion that scholars have against the dominant discourse of hunky-dory, rosy story, poverty reduction, right? So that's something that I would like to see more of. You do get it a bit in the pages of The Guardian, mostly through op-eds though, as opposed to their conventional development reporting. So I mean, there's certainly more room for that that I would like to see. Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to pick up on something that you said a little bit earlier around is the state of aid almost a conspiracy, and international development, a conspiracy to defraud the vulnerable, or is there just a staggering culture of incompetence around the way that these organisations are run and the way that the services are delivered?
I certainly hope that the film does not make people think that all aid is awful and we should stop it. It's not kind of a secret Trumpian message that says, let's not help brown or black people because they're brown or black. Clearly, the film does not think that, and actually a lot of what Jason said before, I agree with in relation to either not so much, well, I guess it's partly a critique of the film, but also the argument that says that if we only have sort of more accountable aid, things will be better. There's obviously a vast number of other issues as well to deal with in nations to make them more accountable to their own people. To me, one of the problems is, and this is particularly direct to the US, is that, and we touch on this mainly, I guess, in Afghanistan and Haiti, less in Papua New Guinea, because the US role there is much smaller, is that the privatised nature of contracting now and the massive amounts of money that are involved in that have to some extent corrupted the process. So a few examples would be after the earthquake in 2010 in Haiti, the US government pledged $10 billion, countless companies go down from the US and are helping the people of Haiti, so to speak. And some of that worked, some of that helped, some of that provided at least immediate assistance after a devastating earthquake, providing water, etc. But in so many of those cases, and we heard this time and time and time again, there's more detail about this in the book than in the film, virtually no Haitians are ever employed. So Company X goes down from Haiti, from Washington or wherever, and they go there for 2 weeks, 2 months, whatever, employ themselves, and then go back to the US. And they may well have maybe helped some people, but there's no long-term thinking. So no locals have been trained, no one's really benefited very much, and a lot of people get pretty damn pissed off because they see all these Americans, particularly, and foreigners, coming and going, often staying at places no one else could afford. Often hotels are built not solely for aid workers, but certainly places for foreigners. I mean, and that undeniably brings resentment, as it would if you're a Haitian who's suffering. So I don't think aid is personally I don't see it as a conspiracy. I do see the real problem, though, in a lot of places that I've visited, that aid often perpetuates issues or conflicts rather than solves them long term. So, last years I was living in Palestine, for example, and there's no doubt there are certain projects in the West Bank and Gaza where Palestinians live that would be worse off if there was not international support for it. In other words, whether it's a solar panel for a small village or some kind of livelihood project in Gaza. Having said that, often the EU and other donors are criticised for perpetuating the Israeli occupation by almost letting Israel off the hook, because they're providing various services that the occupying power should be providing, namely Israel. And, for example, in the West Bank, countless infrastructure is routinely destroyed by the Israeli army. And Europe kind of goes, oh, please don't do that. It has no impact on them continuing to fund it. In other words, I'm not arguing the EU should pull out tomorrow. I'm saying countries that are donors need to stand up to a variety of countries and say, we're not going to perpetuate your occupation, for example. And that's, I think, in Palestine, what's happening a lot.
The first time I met Antony actually was in Palestine, and
in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. And when I was bumping along a road somewhere in the West Bank, I came across this massive sign branded by USAID, a gift from the American people that read, and it was about how the U.S. was giving aid to help with the rebuilding of a Palestinian water pipe. Okay, and what's interesting about this is that the reason that this part of the world doesn't have adequate water is because it's being actively stolen, right, by Israel. And with the support of the U.S. government, which has rejected the resolutions at the UN that have tried to deal with this issue. Okay, so on this basis, the sign makes no sense. Okay, it's an offensive problem, and I think in a way this actually encapsulates what is wrong with aid more generally in the world. And this makes me think of okay. So first, I should say aid is not a conspiracy. I do agree with that. But it is anti-intellectual and counter-revolutionary. So this makes me think of Oscar Wilde, who wrote brilliantly about precisely this issue. And he writes, "It is easier to have sympathy with suffering than to have sympathy with thoughts." And I think that's a profound statement, right? Because it's so easy to go through the world and be moved by the horrendous suffering that we see and want to give aid or charity in response. Without recognizing sort of the upstream causes of that suffering, when the real objects of our intervention should be to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty is impossible in the first place, right? As opposed to sort of weed around the edges of this problem. So I think that aid is a very a dangerous discourse, let's put it that way, that we have to be intellectually wary of.
I mean, just on that point, I completely agree. I mean, the structural issues. Take the war in Yemen, for example, where the UK is backing the Saudi coalition in bombing a fragile state to smithereens and causing a massive famine across the country, and where it's offering, 300 million, I don't know how much exactly, 170 million in aid. And we're supposed to clap and say, oh, great, good aid, and it's selling, $80 billion in weapons or something to the Saudis. So, that there's that. I think we'll see it in certain areas like that. It's very stark in that example. But a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon. And you just think, what's the solution to this? I mean, how is aid even going to help 5 million Syrian refugees? Even if you house them in Jordan or Lebanon, or even, of course, it's caused a massive global refugee crisis. But the solution is an end to the war in Syria. I mean, regardless of what side you're on, I mean, you can't see unless the rest of the world's willing to take on those massive numbers, which Europe and the West aren't. So whose problem are the refugees? How is aid even going to begin to solve that crisis? As much as you can support the Lebanese government and the Jordanian government and address some of the temporary needs of school children. For example, in Lebanon, only 2% of Syrian children complete high school. What's the world? How are you going to deal with millions of children who've never gone, who've lost a generation, who've missed out on schooling opportunities, and that's a future. You can imagine the problems down the line and the responses to that. So again, it's a drop in the ocean, and the political and economic structural reasons need to be addressed economically, whether it's conflict, whether it's the way globalization has taken place through, and the way multinational companies, because we're talking about transnational structures of power, okay, and political governments who operate in a globalized way, and you're talking about local communities who only know their region. How are they going to be? It's great to say we can support people locally and resisting, but how can they resist someone like Rio Tinto that's a global empire?
Well, in that case, they did and they won, but as we saw, with an incredibly high cost. And here we are, and the companies walked away, and there certainly are attempts to try to maybe get Rio Tinto to, pull its finger out, but I'm not that optimistic. But there are attempts to do so by locals there, and there should be, of course. I would say in Iraq and Afghanistan, one certainly could not say that every single amount of money that was spent by the US was simply either wasted or not designed to help some people. I mean, clearly in Afghanistan there are some more roads now. There are some girls who are going to school. I mean, I was opposed to the war in 2001. I'm opposed to the war now. This is not by any means to defend or support the war at all. But yes, there are certain, in inverted commas, improvements that some Afghans are seeing, mostly in and around Kabul, despite the fact that there is insane amounts of violence and rising, and Iraq is not dissimilar to that. In terms of the differences between Germany after the war and what's happening now, I think the US is arguably far more confident in its empire now than it was then. I mean, I have other thoughts about that, but maybe you guys would like to...
why did the Americans go in? What's the point of intervention? What was the reasons given, justification for intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq? And it was democracy. We were going to go there, they were going to greet us with flowers, and we were going to democratize. And whereas in Germany, before the rise of Hitler, you had this a different kind of historical democratic transition. Yes, Hitler was... I'm not going to talk about Germany, but yes, Hitler was voted in. But again, it was the rise of that kind of fascist state, and then dismantling that in a context where you didn't have to actually build that political culture in that way, made it probably easier for the country to gather, unify again around the rebuilding process. Again, all I can think of they're different contexts, but I ask myself the same question. It's really horrible being from the Middle East and seeing the fractures, whether it's because of Sykes-Picot, the way he drew the way. I mean, it's a legacy of colonialism, basically. The way borders were drawn in states, the way the influence of the British, the French. and now the Americans. I'm personally from a country called Bahrain, and we were, the British left in 1975, but they'd always supported the political ruling family there. And despite, uprisings and attempted revolutions every 10 years, the British were always backing the regime. So we could never kind of build a capacity within within our people to kind of stand up against that kind of oppression. So it's difficult. It's easy to say, but it's a region that has been completely bedeviled with colonial legacies, from Lebanon, Palestine. Palestine's a stark example of that. Of a colonial legacy where till the remnants of which we still suffer from until today.
There is I think a misconception, maybe even on the left, but just in general, that an NGO by definition is non-profit. And I'm not saying exactly what you're saying, but some are obviously non-profit. Many NGOs actually are for-profit, and we've seen that in countless. Whether they should call themselves an NGO is another story, but they do for a range of reasons. It looks good to call yourself an NGO instead of a corporation or whatever it may be. And there's no doubt that, for example, one of the worst offenders, we don't talk about this in the film, but it's in the book, is the American Red Cross, who, after the earthquake in Haiti, raised $1 billion, and ProPublica, the American news organisation, did an investigation a few years ago and found they'd built 5 houses with that. It's been a complete disaster, and people often sort of say at these sort of events, what can we do, or what's the next sort of step? Obviously we don't live in the US, but my feeling often is that if people, and maybe Jason would say you shouldn't give aid at all, I don't know exactly, but my feeling is that there are certain times where giving money to certain organisations can help, and I think it has to be very targeted. But if organisations have screwed up, or they're not accountable where their money is going, don't give them the money. American Red Cross gets government money and private money. That's one example. And I think too often groups like that are given positive press because of some of the reasons we've talked about, that I think a lot of people in the media either haven't been to those countries in the first place because the media is in a bit of a crisis at the moment for financial reasons, as we all know. And I think also a lot of people feel like they don't want to be seen as too critical because they're worried it's going to be seen as parochial or paternalistic or whatever it might be. I think we have to choose our language carefully, but I do think that there needs to be massive amounts of more examination about where we give money, just as individuals, let alone as governments. The film focuses on governments, not on you and me. But I do think a lot of people, like everyone in this room who might give aid, I can almost guarantee, it's not a criticism, people here often don't know and aren't even doing maybe basic searches of the organisation's website where that money goes, assuming they're telling the truth, the organisations. It's not always true.
Operational costs.
Operational costs, which could be 2%, 5%, 50%. The American Red Cross with Haiti was a lot.
So it's funny because I think that the right actually doesn't fully understand how useful the 0.7% aid budget is to their own agenda, right? In the sense of creating business opportunities for British businesses abroad, lubricating the expansion of the British free markets, et cetera, and right. But for me, the response to this is not that. The problem with the left is that they feel like they have to react to that by maintaining the status quo. I think that's just not an adequate response. So yes, of course, we need to defend this share of the budget that's given abroad. But why call it aid in the first place, right? If it's for humanitarian assistance, call it that. But otherwise, we should rename it and treat it as something else, right? Like a solidarity fund for formerly colonized nations, for example, or reparations, But I'm not actually for, to answer your question earlier, I'm not actually for this idea of not giving anything, right? Because, for example, right now we know that it's global north nations whose historical emissions have caused the majority of climate change, which hurts the global south most, to the tune of them losing $500 billion per year, okay, which outstrips the aid budget by a factor of 5. The structural adjustment programs imposed on the global south during the 80s and 90s by the World Bank and the IMF, under the command of the US and UK and other G8 nations, caused global south countries on average to lose $500 billion each year in lost GDP. Okay, again, outstripping the aid budget by a factor of 5. So what's needed here is, of course, some kind of transfer from the beneficiaries of the global economy to those who have been, effectively screwed by it. But we shouldn't call it aid, of course. So for me, I want to maintain that transfer and give it a better framing. I think aid is exactly the wrong framing and traps us into these situations where the left is trying to defend something that's clearly regressive in the first place. But our argument should not be to maintain the status quo, but to advance a different vision altogether. So I don't know what you want to call it, but that's clearly the conversation we have to be having. And once we do, then we'll find the right is going to be more than happy to maintain the aid budget, call it aid, and make sure that it continues to serve British interests as it is doing today. And then we'll have a real discussion, right? But right now it's kind of displaced into this bizarre zone of the right not wanting it and the left trying to defend it, which is not where the battle needs to be had.
Just on that, I mean, I was just thinking that as I was thinking about the gentleman's earlier question. I mean, the issue with, it's good to have a kind of a fixed amount, like 0.7%. It's not going to be played around in the next budget, and it's going to go up and down or whatever. It goes down when you're in a recession. It goes up when you're, in a boom. It's always there. The question is, what have the Tories done to that? How you can see it so starkly. I mean, aid is tied directly with British national interests. We will spend where it's obviously. I mean, any country would do that, where it serves our national interests, or where it doesn't serve our national interests. We're not going to spend any money. But why isn't it managed, for example, using an independent governance structure? So an independent body that manages that 0.7% rather than Priti Patel, or I don't even know, Penny Mordaunt, or whatever it is now. So yeah, I think just make it something that's not apolitical, always be political, but it's not the government that's deciding, whoever's in power is deciding to spend the money the way they see fit. It should be who needs the money gets the money. And you need to change the incentives in that way, if that was a decision. But obviously that's an idealistic kind of thing.
Like a question always makes me think that someone like both of you should be far more prominent in the British press to argue those cases. So why is that not happening?
I mean, I just made
it's not
it
your
up.
fault.
I just made it up.
My story.
I just literally made it up. This isn't kind of,
No, I know.
Yeah.
But obviously, in something like with Jason, I mean, you particularly focus on something. I mean, I know you do write about it. Of course, you've written a book about it. But I mean, is that what? Do you feel like, as you said before, that a lot of the media just not interested, or for the reasons we just said before, that there's a very kind of narrow debate that goes on in a handful of media outlets, The Guardian, amongst others?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, there's some of that, I think. But, I mean, no, to me, I think it's not a matter of people not being interested. It's a matter of these ideas are not actually available in the way they should be. But when they do become available, then people are incredibly interested. I can't tell you how many public lectures I've given or speaking to students or even NGOs where there's immense excitement about a different kind of approach. Because everyone can see that the present model we have is fundamentally incorrect and failing. And so people are ready for something different. And it's just a matter of having those ideas accessible, right? So, I mean, we can pound away in The Guardian as much as we can, but we're only individual people, right? We need to build movements around this kind of thing. Those movements, in fact, already exist and have been going on in the Global South for a very long time. Fundamental demands for a fair global economy. Here in the West, I think that the closest that any policymaker has come is the Labour Party Green Paper on International Development, which was just launched a couple of weeks ago.
Did you write that?
I may have had some unpaid role, strictly unpaid
That's a good
role.
thing. That's a good thing. I was just asking.
But look, I mean, and it's not a perfect document, and I don't even agree with everything that's in there. But if you look it up, then you'll see that there's momentum behind, and this is Europe's biggest political party that's coming out in favor of radical policies like, reorganizing voting power in international governance institutions to make them democratic. Have you ever heard a G8 country ask for that kind of thing before? No, never. Wanting to shift actively from a narrative of aid to a narrative of social justice. I mean, this is the kind of language they're using, which marks a step change from everything we've had before for the past number of decades, right? So, there's potential out there, and I think that's if the Labour Party was able to get into governments, then who knows? Maybe this becomes something that is an effective discourse on a broader global stage that we can get behind. Maybe it also gets diluted into something that we can't support anymore. And if that's the case, then we write articles in The Guardian against the Labour Party. Here we are.
I mean, one of the campaigns I'm involved in is closing down British offshore systems, for example. So where does all this money made or the profit made go? It goes into basically mostly Western-run tax havens, under British jurisdiction. So that's the counter to that. Is okay, why we focus on the poor and the marginalised and helping them and calling it aid for your white saviour complex or whatever. Let's look at the elites who are siphoning off that exploitation into tax havens where they pay zero tax. They get away with it legally. And so we've seen the Panama Papers, we've seen the paradigm. I mean, there seems to be a change there in the sense of trying to dismantle that, because that's quite systemic. And we're talking trillions and trillions, enough probably to solve the developing world countries twice over in terms of the amount of money that's in tax in the city of London, like down the road. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, I think, where do we focus our energy and time? And so, yes, our issues around aid are legitimate. But again, let's not let that distract us from what the elites are getting away with in terms of not just laundering money, but hiding and not paying tax and doing all of that. Because again, that just avoids the entire redistribution mechanisms, the small, whatever redistribution mechanisms we have in this country, and they have the power to even negotiate their tax rates. So they come back and say, well, yes, I've got most of my, 1 billion annually in tax abroad, but I'll give you 10 million to the HMRC. That's the kind of deal. So they actually cut deals around their tax obligations. And that's what really riles me. I get more angry about that than anything else. I mean, there's been a success there because it's a lot of Russian money as well. So there's politics around that, because while you've got this, Cold War happening with Russia, a lot of Russian money are in tax havens, are being laundered through systems in the UK, facilitated by lawyers, accountants, estate agents. And we give a lovely tour called the Kleptocracy Tour. We have a bus, and it's not public, but you go around the whole of London to see all of the prime real estate, Knightsbridge, Kensington, Park Lane, you name it, all those kind of shiny 5-star apartments and houses, fancy houses, and they're all really they're all paid for by corrupt politicians from across the world, whether it's Nigerian, Russian, Arab, where investigative journalists have exposed that corruption, and somehow, whether locally or in this country, and yet it's legal. You will never know who owns that property because it's registered to an offshore account. So a lot of that money, a lot of the effects of that disaster, the disaster capitalism, is actually being invested and is stored, but in the long term, right here on our doorsteps.
I guess I'll just say one very brief thing about that. It was interesting that many of you will be aware there was a natural disaster in Puerto Rico recently, and you had all these American crypto utopians who moved down there. That's sort of their term, not really mine. People who made a lot of money through Bitcoin and others, cryptocurrencies. They basically have gone down to Puerto Rico, and they talk about this whole idea, we're going to go down there and rebuild the society much better. So they say, build it back better. And obviously the country experienced a massive shock. They've gone down, and essentially it's the same old bullshit with different language. The tax rate there is minimal to non-existent. The regulation around building near the shore is virtually non-existent. So they basically want to go down there and rebuild a society in this image, which is exactly the same as every other colonial minded person will have done in New Orleans or Haiti. The fact that it's now being done with sort of crypto utopians doesn't change a damn thing. They like to think it does, but it doesn't change anything. The problem is that, again, we come back to the problem with the media, that virtually no one's reporting on that. It's not a conspiracy or a secret, it's just not much journalism is happening there. So if you think that, not that anyone in this room maybe does, but if anyone thinks that the crypto utopians are going to save the world, they're probably not.
Well, I think that, let's be honest, I think that shocks are probably coming. And I think that what we need to do, and this is basically Naomi Klein's argument I'm stealing here, right? we need to be able to use the tools of the shock doctrine, which is what she calls it, against, for our own purposes, against oppressive systems, right? So we know that shocks are coming. We know that there will be another financial crisis, more than likely, possibly bigger than the last. We know that climate change is going to continue to bring us recurrent shocks that may dismantle some of the key features of the global civilization that we've come to regard as everlasting, right? As these things happen, we need to be prepared to find alternatives that are resilient, community-oriented, that allow us to flourish as humans and build the kind of world that we want, and be always on the lookout for the alternative, which is disaster capitalism. So we need to be aware of how the tactic works and see if we can jujitsu it, I suppose, against those who have a different vision for what the world should look like.